Formatting the annotation, so introduce, summarize, quote, explain, analyze, and reflect. So when you think about introducing the source, if we have to know the purpose of the source. Why are you bringing in that source? You just don't stick something in there without preparing the reader for it. So you introduce the source by identifying information, including the following. So that's your genre. If this is a fictional work, a non-fictional work, a poem, an autobiography, a biography, what type of work is it? Then the name of author, title of work, and that author's thesis. So if you are saying all dogs are nice as your thesis, right, that you want to support with evidence, then we need to know if that author believes all dogs are nice if they lick your face. Then that gives us some idea that that author is serving as a contrast or a counter argument or a rebuttal to your main argument. So introducing the source, if you do this well in your annotation, it's not going to be hard for you to integrate, cut and paste it into your paper because you've already prepped the reader by introducing it. And then you provide identifying information, and then you give us a thesis for us to understand and work with. So here's a sample annotation with introduce. So let's look at Duckworth and Gross again. They discuss the differences between self-control and grit, as the former is required to manage everyday momentary impulses, and the latter is directly correlated to long-term achievement. The authors offer a unique exploration of the differences between self-control and grit by providing a visual of the hierarchical goal framework. The authors use various examples to explore their points of views about the two concepts. The work is a peer-reviewed journal article. So we've already introduced the source. If we introduced this source initially, we would have introduced the source for what you see here is an APA format. So you introduce the authors with the year of publication. Versus if this was MLA format, you would introduce the authors with the title of work. And then look at the citation there, hierarchical goal framework. That is specific to these authors' works. So anytime you have a term that is mentioned within their work, and it is specific to them explaining hierarchical goal framework, you want to place that in quotation mark. And then for APA format, you would usually bring in the two authors' last name connected with an ampersand, comma, year of publication, comma, and then page 321 where you found the information. And notice that the period or the punctuation mark goes at the end of the last parentheses. So that's how you would introduce it. You introduce what the authors are doing. You may quote something in what they are doing, and then you back it up with some sort of identifying information. And you can always bring that identifying information much earlier in the peer-reviewed journal article by Duckworth and Gross. They discuss the differences between self-control and grit, and then you just keep going on. So how you introduce it does make a big difference, because we need to know what that author thinks, or those two authors think, in contrast to what you are trying to argue in your own paper. Let's look at summarizing quote. So summarize enter a quote from the source. You want to summarize the source by the main arguments. Summarize the main points explored. Summarize any counter arguments the source explores. Use quotes when necessary and or appropriate. So MLA really allows you to bring in quoting, a lot of quoting, not too much to overtake the paper. But you can block quote, you can bring in a 3-line quote, right? And you won't really be penalized for it. But in the sciences or like psychology, it's sort of frowned upon to bring in so many different types of quotes. You can reference and add a citation reference, but quoting is not so much, I guess, admired. So when you are summarizing the quote or summarizing the source tells us that you understand the source, that you understand what purpose it is serving. So if you read something, take just 5 to 10 minutes to think about it, maybe jot down a few ideas and see if you can summarize that information. Now think about this in terms of the many sources that you are going to have to use within your paper. If you are only working with one source, say for instance, I usually have students write a reading summary, and so they only need to use one source and then create a works cited at the end. That's much easier to figure out what the main arguments are. Look at the counter arguments, right? But then if you are introducing integrating 5 sources, a minimum of 5 sources, or even 10 sources for certain courses, you're going to need to know all of the different arguments of that particular those particular works so you understand. And you need to jot down the main points of what they are exploring, sort of like a key takeaway. And then any counter arguments, what they have a main argument, right? So then what are the counter arguments that they are exploring? And then and if those counter arguments are represented in their summary or in quotes. So if you are integrating a quote that they have quoted, then it's going to be a quote within your paper. And MLA, APA, Chicago Style has guidelines, all have guidelines for how you represent quoting and how you represent quotes within a quote. So whatever source the instructor gives you to refer to, you want to make sure you do that, because you utilize that source, because you don't want to misrepresent sources. Anyone reading your paper has to be able to go back and look at and check those sources against the main source. So then here is a sample annotation, also APA format. Their argument is self-control and grit are strongly correlated, but not perfectly so. So where you see brackets here are around the S, that means that the sentence actually began with an uppercase letter, so that it began with a sentence. But when you integrate it within your paper, or you are integrating it as a sentence within your paper, your sentence, your words along with the quote still have to be grammatical. So we wouldn't necessarily have an uppercase letter, self-control and grit, where you already have an uppercase letter that begins with their argument. So then, because we need to make it grammatical, we need to lowercase the s using brackets and then continue on. You also want to take note of the quotation marks, that this is direct wording, and you place quotation marks around direct wording. So there's beginning and ending quotation marks. Then it is cited, it is formatted as in APA format, because the source is part of the psychology discipline, and they use APA. If you were using, say for instance, MLA, then you would just need Duckworth, the word and gross, and then 319. You wouldn't need the year of publication or commas or P period. You would just need Duckworth and gross 319. So do keep the difference in mind. So now you want to explain the source. So explain any use of summary and or quote. Explain the usefulness of the source. Explain how the source compares to other sources. And explain the reliability of the source, meaning that you should be able to depend upon the source if it is especially a primary source. So as soon as you integrate a quote or even summarize that information from a source, you want to then explain it. That means you have to have a good understanding of what it is you are explaining. And then you want to get into the usefulness. This source is useful because, and you have to determine that in terms of what you believe the usefulness of the source is. And then explain how the source compares to other sources. You can use that contrasting language, whereas one source believes this source right here believes that, right? Jane believes that we should go to the store, in contrast to Joe believes we should go to the movies, or something like that. It's very simple, but you have to know if there is a contrast or a comparison between the two sources in order to make that point. And what that does is, you explaining the source within your paper and connecting source, shows us that you are engaging the sources, and in order for you to engage the sources, you have to know the sources. So it makes a big difference when you understand what it is that you are integrating into your paper. And then of course reliability is you making sure that not only you can rely on the source, but also the reader and the audience at large. So if we were looking at the annotation in terms of explaining the source, this is how we might explain it. This means that self-controlling grit may have some correlation, but they are not identical. What the authors suggest is that our previous understanding about self-controlling grit as grouped together under willpower should be challenged, as grit instead requires a tenacious pursuit towards a dominant goal despite setbacks, whereas self-control does not require long-term commitment. And understanding the difference, the way that the authors present it in the work, that grit requires this long-term concentration, conscientiousness, commitment to achieving and accomplishing a long-term goal, which they label as superordinate goal. And so that takes much study, that takes much time writing on it, researching, presenting at conferences, doing all that you can to try to understand the problem in order for you to be able to resolve it. Self-control, you need self-control at multiple levels in order to sort of employ grit. But self-control only requires that you really manage your momentary impulses. So if you are sitting in a classroom, a 50-minute lecture, you need self-control to stay there and take notes and write it down and then jump up and leave once the lecture is over. If you get up 10 minutes into the lecture, you lack self-control. You understand that you have to take courses towards a degree. You can't miss a bunch of courses and still pass that courses leading up to more courses leading up to the accomplishment of a degree. And so that's why you want to take some time to understand the differences, what they're doing, because a lot of times students will look at willpower and immediately think the paper is about willpower or the journal article is about willpower. Whereas the authors are saying that's how we used to look at grit before and understand grit before under the umbrella of willpower. But now we need to look at grit from a different vantage point, that it is connected to achievement, whereas self-control is connected to managing a momentary impulse, temptation to do something other than what you are doing in that moment. And that's why you need the explaining. You need to be able to explain, and the only way that's going to happen is your ability to understand the source. And also notice that we're just summarizing here. So willpower is a word used within the text. I did place quotation marks around it. You could easily add a citation reference, but it's also sort of the use of this willpower is also kind of common knowledge. We may not necessarily need a definition. I don't remember if the source actually used a definition. And so we're just highlighting willpower in contrast to the use of other terms within the work. So there's no real citation needed here. Then we look at analyze. So analyze the source, analyze how the source fits within your research, analyze the usefulness of the source, analyze how the source supports or opposes your tentative argument. And always remember that creating the annotated bibliography will help you to formulate a thesis, but you can change that thesis anytime you want to because it is your paper. But it does help to understand what your thesis is in order for you to be able to analyze the use and integration of sources within your paper. So how does the source fit within your research? So again, that goes back to one of the reasons why you write an annotated bibliography, to determine where a source fits. That's why it might be a good idea to present when the source was published, what were the surrounding arguments around that source, especially the year. Does it represent the canon? Whatever information you can bring to the paper. And then the usefulness of the source, you could make the case that the source is part of the canon, but may not be useful for your research. And that in your concluding area, you have come to realize that though the source is a useful source for the topic, it may be something that you have to put off to the side later and consult on a different research project. So you can make the case for analyzing the usefulness or less than usefulness of the source. And then, of course, analyze how the source supports or opposes your tentative argument. And again, you have to know what your argument is while you are writing your paper from all the research you've done in terms of the annotated bibliography, to now look at what is your tentative argument and if the source is going to work and be functional. So then here is an example. What is useful for their work is the idea that goals can be categorized using their hierarchical goal framework to determine the types of goals that are substitutable and the types of goals that should be fewer in number and more enduring. Most self-controlled goals can be changed, whereas goals that center on a grit objective require goals to be more enduring. Now, if we've already referenced hierarchical goal framework and added a citation in the paper, we don't necessarily have to reference it. We don't necessarily have to create a citation reference again. We could place it in quotation marks because it is not a term specific to us initiating the term. It is specific to the author's works, and so we want to make sure that we give the right and proper respect in terms of referencing. But analysis is just really understanding the difference between what the authors are putting forth and helping us understand the distinction between self-control and grit. And then, of course, you can continue to go on and add more analysis, right, depending upon what your tentative thesis is and what you are trying to prove. And then reflect on the source. So reflect on your tentative argument and the argument of the sources. Reflect on where the source might be useful practically or with any other research. Reflect on your goals and purpose for research. And then reflect on your revision of your tentative thesis. So the more that you write an annotated bibliography and the content after researching, reading, and writing, now you always keep in mind your tentative argument and whether or not it's going to be a permanent argument or whether or not you're going to have to revise that tentative thesis. So that's why you want to make sure you understand the arguments of the source materials. You want to make sure you understand your own argument so that so that you can properly reflect on it. And then reflect on where the source might be useful practically or with any other research. And that's why I said I think that the self-control and grit source from Duckworth and Gross, I use this for annotated bibliography as well as other sources to help students prepare for the grit essay. And then this helps them just overall in terms of their psychology and understanding the types of goals they have to set. So I feel like not only is it useful practically in helping them to write an annotated bibliography and learn about a particular topic, because grit is a psychology-based scholarly topic, not just an athletically based topic. So they can learn about a topic, a particular concept housed within a specific discipline, and then also where they might find it useful in their regular waking everyday lives, that when they are setting goals, what type of goals are they setting? Are they setting a grit goal or a self-control goal? So I think that's also important. So it is practical not only for the academic classroom, but it's also practical for the professional context as well as personal. Reflect on your goals and purpose for research. So there's a reason why you are conducting this research. And then think about whether or not you will have to revise your tentative thesis. And that's why you need that third paragraph under the annotation that third paragraph under the bibliography entry, so that you know that this source is not just useful for you writing a paper, but that it has larger implications for what you might want to do later. And then here's the sample annotation. So this source will be useful for a teaching demonstration in a composition classroom. So that actually applies to me, why I would use this source. It could be a peer review target. It could be a board lecture. It could be just a regular lecture that I use. So this source is not only useful for helping students to learn about the topic, but useful for me to demonstrate as a teaching objective. So let's look at MLA. We understand that MLA requires the full names of the authors, right? Or whatever is presented on the source. And then you begin it with the last name, and however their name is presented on the main source, that's how you present it here. And it is connected with an and then the full name of the author's name. And so then self-control and grit, related but separable determinants of success, is placed in quotation marks. And then that source is housed within current directions and psychological science. And you have all of the information there in terms of page numbers and date, year of publication. Of course, you would have where you obtain that information in terms of the website and the date that you access that information. So this is 8th edition MLA. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes you don't need the URL. I want to have it just in case I need to access this source again. But you definitely want to add the access date when you access this source. So then you have your 3 paragraphs. First, you introduce the source, Duckworth and Gross, discuss the differences between self-control and grit, as the former is required to manage everyday momentary impulses, and the latter is directly correlated to long-term achievement. So that's just a quick introduction. Then you want to look at a bit of analysis. So what the author suggests is that our previous understanding about self-control and grit as grouped together under willpower should be challenged, as grit instead requires a tenacious pursuit towards a dominant goal despite setbacks, whereas self-control does not require long-term commitment. You have to read the source, and it's roughly 5 to 6 pages as a journal article, to really get an understanding that even though the authors are mentioning the word willpower, the article is not about willpower. The article is about showing you that's how we used to perceive grit, as having willpower. That grit actually has a greater distinction in contrast to self-control, which requires that you manage your momentary impulse. Whereas with grit, you have to tenaciously pursue a dominant goal for years, even decades, despite the many setbacks you will endure. And the only way that you're going to get a really good understanding of it is to read the whole work. And then reflecting on it, what is useful for their work is the idea that goals can be categorized using their hierarchical goal framework to determine the types of goals that are substitutable and the types of goals that should be fewer in number and more enduring. This source would be useful for a teaching demonstration in a composition classroom. And I actually use this source in my composition classroom. But this gives you an understanding of how you might use the source. When you are creating the annotation, you want to think about what is being introduced, a little bit of a distinction between it and another source, and how you might be able to use the source in a particular capacity, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's for a future research project that you are considering, or whether it is for a teaching target that I often use. I often use it as a peer review target as well. So this is a sample format for MLA.